Thomas is 32 years old, and he is still single. One day a friend asked, "Why aren't you married? Can't you find a woman who will be a good wife?" Thomas replied, "Actually, I've found many women I wanted to marry, but when I bring them home to meet my parents, my mother doesn't like them." His friend thinks for a moment and says, "I've got the perfect solution, just find a girl who's just like your mother." A few months later, they meet again, and his friend says, "Did you find the perfect girl? Did your mother like her?" With a frown on his face, Thomas answers, "Yes, I found the perfect girl. She was just like my mother." "You were right, my mother liked her very much." The friend said, "Then what's the problem?" Thomas replied, "My father doesn't like her." An Irishman walks into a bar in Dublin, orders 3 pints of Guinness, and sits in the back of the room, drinking a sip out of each one in turn. When he finishes them, he comes back to the bar and orders 3 more. The bartender approaches and tells him, "You know, a pint goes flat after I draw it, and it would taste better if you bought one at a time." The Irishman replies, "Well, you see, I have 2 brothers. One is in America, the other is in Australia, and I'm in Dublin. When we all left home, we promised that we'd drink this way to remember the days we drank together. So I drink one for each of my brothers and one for myself." The bartender admits that this is a nice custom and leaves it there. The Irishman becomes a regular in the bar and always drinks the same way. He orders 3 pints and drinks them in turn. One day, he comes in and orders 2 pints. All the other regulars take notice and fall silent. When he comes back to the bar for the second round, the bartender says, "I don't want to intrude on your grief, but I wanted to offer my condolences on your loss." The Irishman looks quite puzzled for a moment, then a light dawns and he laughs. "Oh, no, everybody's just fine," he explains. "It's just that my wife had us join that Baptist church, and I had to quit drinking. But it hasn't affected me, brothers, though." An older couple, who were both widowed, had been going out with each other for a long time. Urged on by their friends, they decided it was finally time to get married. Before the wedding, they went out to dinner and had a long conversation regarding how their marriage might work. They discussed finances, living arrangements, and so on. Finally, the old gentleman decided it was time to broach the subject of their physical relationship. "How do you feel about S***X?" he asked, rather tentatively. "I would like it infrequently," she replied. The old gentleman sat quietly for a moment, adjusted his glasses, then leaned over towards her and whispered, "Is that 1 word or 2? A married couple went to the hospital to have their baby delivered. Upon their arrival, the doctor said he had invented a new machine that would transfer a portion of the mother's labor pain to the father. He asked if they were willing to try it out. They were both very much in favor of it. The doctor set the pain transfer to 10% for starters, explaining that even 10% was probably more pain than the father had ever experienced before. But as the labor progressed, the husband felt fine and asked the doctor to go ahead and kick it up a notch. The doctor then adjusted the machine to 20% pain transfer. The husband was still feeling fine. The doctor checked the husband's blood pressure and was amazed at how well he was doing. At this point, they decided to try for 50%. The husband continued to feel quite well. Since the pain transfer was obviously helping out the wife considerably, the husband encouraged the doctor to transfer all the pain to him. The wife delivered a healthy baby with virtually no pain. She and her husband were ecstatic. When they got home, the mailman was dead on the porch. The Smiths were unable to conceive children and decided to use a surrogate father to start their family. On the day the proxy father was to arrive, Mr. Smith kissed his wife goodbye and said, "Well, I'm off now. The man should be here soon." Half an hour later, just by chance, a door-to-door baby photographer happened to ring the doorbell, hoping to make a sale. "Good morning," he said. "I've come to—" "Oh, no need to explain," Mrs. Smith cut in, embarrassed. "I've been expecting you." "Have you really?" said the photographer. "Well, that's good. Did you know babies are my specialty?" "Well, that's what my husband and I had hoped." Please come in and have a seat. After a moment, she asked, blushing, well, where do we start? Leave everything to me. I usually try 2 in the bathtub, 1 on the couch, and perhaps a couple on the bed. And sometimes the living room floor is fun. You can really spread out there. Bathtub, living room floor? No wonder it didn't work out for Harry and me. Well, none of us can guarantee a good one every time. But if we try several different positions and I shoot from 6 or 7 angles, I'm sure you'll be pleased with the results. My, that's a lot, gasped Mrs. Smith. In my line of work, a man has to take his time. I'd love to bin and out in 5 minutes, but I'm sure you'd be disappointed with that. Don't I know it, said Mrs. Smith quietly. The photographer opened his briefcase and pulled out a portfolio of his baby pictures. This was done on the top of a bus, he said. Oh, my God! Mrs. Smith exclaimed, grasping at her throat. And these twins turned out exceptionally well, when you consider their mother was so difficult to work with. She was difficult? I asked Mrs. Smith. Yes, I'm afraid so. I finally had to take her to the park to get the job done right. People were crowding around 4 and 5 deep to get a good look. 4 and 5 deep? Said Mrs. Smith, her eyes wide with amazement. Yes, the photographer replied, and for more than 3 hours, too. The mother was constantly squealing and yelling. I could hardly concentrate, and when darkness approached, I had to rush my shots. Finally, when the squirrels began nibbling on my equipment, I just had to pack it all in. Mrs. Smith leaned forward. Do you mean they actually chewed on your, equipment? It's true, yes. Well, if you're ready, I'll set up my tripod, and we can get to work right away. Tripod? Oh yes, I need to use a tripod to rest my Canon on. It's much too big to be held in the hand for very long. Mrs. Smith fainted. A man is in bed with his wife when there is a knock on the door. He rolls over and looks at his clock, and it's 3 a.m. I'm not getting out of bed at this time, he thinks, and he rolls over. Then, a louder knock follows. Aren't you going to answer that? Says his wife. So he drags himself out of bed and goes downstairs. He opens the door, and there is a man standing at the door. It didn't take the homeowner long to realize the man was drunk. Hi there, slurs the stranger, can you give me a push? No, get lost, it's 3 a.m. I was in bed, says the man, who slams the door. He goes back up to bed and tells his wife what happened, and she says, Dave, that wasn't very nice of you. Remember that night we broke down in the pouring rain on the way to pick up the kids from the babysitter, and you had to knock on that man's house to get us started again? What would have happened if he'd told us to get lost? But the guy was drunk, says the husband. It doesn't matter, says the wife. He needs our help, and it would be the Christian thing to help him. So the husband gets out of bed again, gets dressed, and goes downstairs. He opens the door, and not being able to see the stranger anywhere, he shouts, Hey, do you still want to push? And he hears a voice cry out, Yeah, please. So, still being unable to see the stranger, he shouts, Where are you? And the stranger replies, I'm over here, on your swing.